Leadership rarely breaks all at once. It usually wears people down slowly, week by week, as small responsibilities accumulate without ever being released. Most tech leads don't wake up one morning to find they're burned out. They wake up feeling slightly behind, mentally tired before the day even starts, responsible for things they can't quite name. Nothing feels catastrophic. Everything feels heavier than it should. If that sounds familiar, this episode is for you. Welcome to Lead Don't Control. This is the podcast where we talk about tech leadership, developer careers, and the stuff you don't hear in stand ups or performance reviews. If you're tired of micromanagement, empty buzzwords, and leadership advice that sounds good but doesn't actually work, you're in the right place. I'm Nick. Let's get into it. Welcome back. Today, I want to talk about something that doesn't get talked about often enough in tech leadership: the hidden weight of the tech lead role. I've seen it happen to good people. I felt it myself. Not all at once, but slowly. When my calendar started filling up, decisions kept waiting on me, and I couldn't quite explain why everything felt heavier. And the frustrating part is that it usually shows up when you're trying to do the job well. This episode isn't about productivity. It's not about burnout tips, and it's definitely not about working harder. It's about why leadership starts to feel heavier over time, even when you're doing what looks like the right things. If you've caught yourself thinking, why does this feel more draining than I expected? Or why does everything route through me? You're in the right place. By the end of this episode, I want you to have two things: a clear name for what's happening and a way to recognize it early before it turns into something heavier. The weight of leadership builds slowly over time. There's no single incident, no obvious mistake, no clear turning point you can look back on and say, that's when it changed. It builds quietly. At first, it shows up in small, reasonable ways. A few more questions start coming your way. A few more decisions wait for your input. A little more context starts living in your head than it used to. None of this feels wrong. In fact, it often feels like progress. People trust you. They value your judgment. They know you'll respond. Early on, that feels good. You feel useful. You feel relied on. You feel like you're doing the job well. And here's the important part: you are doing the job well. That's what makes this so hard to notice. Over time, the accumulation starts to show. Work doesn't just come to you occasionally, it starts flowing through you. Questions come to you first, even when someone else on the team should be the one answering them. Decisions pause until you weigh in, even when the path forward is already clear. Information concentrates instead of spreading. And this doesn't happen because you demanded control. It doesn't happen because you don't trust the team. And it doesn't happen because you're trying to be important. It happens because the system is learning how work gets done. It learns that you're responsive. It learns that you'll answer quickly. It learns that involving you feels safe. And responsiveness, especially in tech, gets rewarded. At this point, most tech leads don't feel overloaded. They feel busy. They feel needed. Their days are full, but still manageable. But the load is changing shape. It's no longer just tasks. It's decisions. It's judgment calls. It's holding context across conversations, meetings, and time. That kind of load is harder to see and harder to put down. This is usually where people start compensating without realizing it. They stay closer to the work than they plan to. They answer questions faster than they should. They jump in earlier than necessary, not because they want control, but because it keeps things moving. And movement feels like success, especially early in leadership. Activity feels safe. You're responding, you're unblocking, you're preventing problems. But there's a trade off hiding underneath that activity. As more work routes through you, the system starts adapting around your availability. Meetings get scheduled based on when you can attend. Decisions wait until you're free. Progress slows when you're not around. And that's when the weight really starts to show up. Not as panic, not as crisis, but as a constant mental hum you can't quite turn off. Most people don't notice this happening in real time because every individual moment still feels reasonable. Each question makes sense. Each decision feels small on its own. Each interruption seems manageable. It's only later, looking back, that the pattern becomes obvious. And by then, the weight feels normal. This is often where mental exhaustion starts to creep in. Not because anything went wrong, not because you failed, but because the load kept increasing without ever being redistributed. That's the quiet danger of accumulation. One of the hardest parts about this accumulation is that it tends to affect the people who are actually good at the job. And it shows up a little differently depending on where you are in the role. For new tech leads, everything is unfamiliar, so there's no clear baseline yet. For more experienced leads, the same pattern can quietly reappear when teams change, scope grows, or expectations shift. In both cases, the accumulation often goes unnoticed for the same reason. Competence hides it. Smart people are good at adapting. They're good at absorbing complexity. They're good at filling gaps when something isn't quite working. So when leadership starts pulling more responsibility inward, capable people adjust without making noise. They don't complain. They don't panic. They just handle it. And because things keep moving, there's no obvious signal that anything is off. Another reason this gets missed is that tech culture rewards responsiveness. Answering quickly is seen as helpful. Being available is seen as leadership. Jumping in is seen as ownership. Those signals are reinforced early and often. And there's another layer to this. When someone moves from being a doer into a leadership role, they don't get a new playbook. But the people around them don't get one either. The same teammates, stakeholders, and partners are still there. And they're still interacting with you the way they always have. Not because they're ignoring your new role, not because they don't respect boundaries, but because the relationship hasn't been redesigned yet. So when work starts routing through you, it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like you're meeting expectations. There's also a subtle identity shift happening here. Most tech leads come from roles where being the one with the answers mattered, where speed and correctness were visible signals of value. Letting go of that doesn't happen overnight. So even when the role changes, the instinct to step in stays strong. Not out of ego, not out of control, but out of habit. And finally, this is easy to miss because nothing breaks immediately. The team is still delivering. Stakeholders are still satisfied. Problems are still getting solved. So there's nothing that clearly tells you that you need to rethink how you're operating until the weight starts showing up elsewhere, in your energy, in your focus, and how hard it is to think clearly at the end of the week. This is why so many capable leaders end up carrying more than they should for longer than they should. Not because they don't know better, but because they're good enough to compensate. And compensation works until it becomes the norm. What makes accumulation so tricky is that the cost doesn't show up where you expect it to. It doesn't usually look like failure. It doesn't show up as a crisis, and it rarely arrives as a single breaking point. Instead, it spreads out. On a personal level, the first thing that changes is your energy. Not in a dramatic way, just a steady drain. You finish the day more tired than you expect to be. You wake up already thinking about decisions that didn't get made. And even when you're not actively working, your mind keeps looping. The things you need to do, the things you didn't get to, the things you know you should come back to. Not because you're anxious, but because the work never fully leaves your head. Your brain feels busy even when you're not actively working. That's not because you're weak. It's because you're holding unresolved context is expensive. As the load builds, decision making starts to feel heavier too. Not because the decisions themselves are harder, but because there are more of them waiting on you. Small choices start to feel oddly draining. Things you used to do quickly now take more effort. That's decision fatigue. Not as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow erosion of clarity. At the same time, the cost starts showing up in the system around you. When work routes through one person, everything else adjusts to that constraint. The team hesitates more, not because they lack skill, but because they're waiting. Decisions slow down, not because people disagree, but because they're deferring. This is where growth quietly stalls. Team members don't get the reps they need. Judgment doesn't spread. Ownership stays centralized. And none of that is intentional. It's just the natural outcome of accumulation. What makes this especially hard is that from the outside, things still look fine. Work gets delivered. Deadlines are met. Stakeholders aren't complaining. So the cost stays mostly invisible. But invisibility doesn't mean harmless. Over time, this combination takes a toll. You feel more responsible, but less effective. You're involved in more things, but have less space to think. And the team relies on you more, even though that reliance was never the goal. This is often the moment where people start questioning themselves. Why does this feel harder than it should? Why does this feel so much heavier than it used to? Those questions aren't signs of failure. They're signals. Signals that the cost of carrying too much has started to compound. Here's what's important to understand. What you experience isn't a lack of discipline. It isn't a motivation problem, and it isn't a personal shortcoming. It's a design problem. When responsibility accumulates without being deliberately shared, the system adapts around the person carrying the load. Not because anyone decided it should work that way, not because someone failed to set boundaries, but because systems naturally optimize for what keeps things moving. If routing decisions, answers, and context through you keeps work flowing, that's what the system will do. This is where clarity matters, because once you see this as a system behavior, it stops feeling like a personal burden you just need to carry. It becomes something you can understand, and eventually, something you can redesign. A lot of leadership advice skips straight to behavior. Communicate more, delegate better. But behavior without clarity just adds pressure. If you don't understand why the load accumulated, you'll keep compensating for it, even while trying to fix it. The important realization here is this: the role changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but structurally. The work moved from doing to deciding, from solving to shaping, from answering questions to deciding how answers get found. When that shift isn't made explicit, people keep operating the old way and compensate when it doesn't quite fit anymore. This is where some relief usually shows up. Not because the load disappears, but because it finally makes sense. You weren't failing to keep up. You were carrying a role that hadn't been redesigned yet. Understanding that makes a difference because it changes the question from, how do I work harder to keep up? To, how should this role actually operate? That's the turning point. Once you see this as a design problem, the goal shifts. It's no longer about carrying more efficiently. It's about designing the role so the weight doesn't accumulate in the first place. The most important shift here is in how you think about leverage. As an individual contributor, leverage often comes from speed, from depth, from being the one who can solve hard problems quickly. As a tech lead, leverage comes from something else entirely. As a leader, speed often comes from slowing things down. Slowing conversations enough to clarify decisions. Slowing work down enough to remove friction. Slowing the system down so the team can actually move faster. Leverage comes from shaping how decisions get made, from clarifying who owns what, from creating paths where work can move without routing through you. This doesn't mean you disappear, and it doesn't mean you stop contributing. It means your contribution changes form. When the role is designed well, your presence creates space instead of pressure. The team doesn't have to wait for answers because they know where the answers live. Decisions don't stall because ownership is clear. And you're not less involved, you're involved differently. This is also where a subtle fear tends to show up. If you're not the one answering everything, if you're not in every decision, what's your value now? That question is normal. And it's a sign that your identity is catching up to the role. The value doesn't disappear when you stop absorbing. It shows up when others don't need you as often. When judgment spreads. When clarity replaces interruption. When the system holds more of the load than you do. That's not a loss of control. That's leverage. This is the difference between a role designed around responsiveness and one designed around intent. Responsiveness feels useful in the moment. Intent creates sustainability over time. And while this shift doesn't happen overnight, it starts with seeing the role clearly. One of the reasons accumulation happens so easily is that most of the work a tech lead does is invisible. People don't see the weight you're carrying. They don't see the trade-offs you're considering. They don't see the context you're holding from one conversation to the next. So they default to what they can see. This is where intention matters. Not as a declaration, not as an announcement, but as something you make visible through how you show up. When intention stays private, people fill in the gaps with old assumptions. They come to you because that's what worked before. They wait for you because that's what feels safe. Not because they lack judgment, but because the system hasn't shown a new path yet. Making intention visible doesn't mean explaining everything you do. It means being deliberate about what you reinforce, what you answer immediately, what you redirect, what you slow down. Those moments teach the system how to behave. When you pause instead of answering, when you're not withholding help, you're signaling that the answer doesn't have to live with you. When you redirect a question to someone else, you're not pushing work away. You're reinforcing ownership. This is also why consistency matters more than correctness. You don't have to get it perfect. You just have to be predictable. Because systems adapt to patterns, not assumptions you keep quietly in your head. Over time, those small changes add up. People start answering each other. Decisions move without waiting on you. Context spreads instead of concentrating. Not because you stepped back completely, but because you showed the system how to move without you. This is what it looks like to redesign interaction instead of workload. You're not doing less, you're shaping more. And the system responds. One of the strange parts of redesigning the role is that often it feels worse before it feels better. Not because things are breaking, but because the feedback has changed. You may notice you're less central to day-to-day conversations. Fewer questions land in your inbox. More discussions happen without you. That can feel unfamiliar, but it's usually a sign of redistribution. You might also notice moments of discomfort. Pausing instead of answering feels awkward. Redirecting questions feels like you're stepping back. Those moments are part of the transition. They don't mean you're disengaging. They mean you're changing how the system learns. Another signal is how the team responds to uncertainty. Instead of waiting, they start deciding. Instead of escalating, they start discussing. And instead of looking for permission, they look for clarity. This is also where trust quietly grows. Not because you said something, but because your behavior stayed consistent. People learn what you mean by what you reinforce. If you notice these shifts, even in small ways, it's worth paying attention. They're signs the role is starting to work differently. If there's one thing to take from this, it's this. The weight you've been feeling isn't a personal flaw. It's a signal that the role changed, but the design didn't. You weren't meant to absorb everything. You weren't meant to be the answer to every question, and you weren't meant to carry the system on your back. The tech lead role isn't about becoming more central. It's about becoming more intentional. When the role is designed well, you stop being the bottleneck that keeps from moving and start becoming the reason everything else can move. That's not stepping away. That's stepping into the work that actually matters. If parts of this felt uncomfortable, that's normal. Discomfort isn't the job. It's a symptom of learning a role most people are never taught how to do. And clarity is the first real relief. You didn't need to fix everything at once. You don't need to overhaul how you lead tomorrow. You just need to stop mistaking accumulation for responsibility. Because the goal was never to carry more, it was to design better. And once you see that, you don't unsee it. That's the role you're actually stepping into. If this episode helped you put words to something you've been carrying, I wrote a short guide called the Tech Lead Operating System. It doesn't add more rules, it's structure to the shift we've been talking about. You can find it in the show notes. if and when it's useful. I'm talking about. You can find it in the show notes. If and when it's useful. If this episode was useful, share it with someone who needs to hear it, especially if they're dealing with bad leadership. You can find me at leaddon'tcontrol.com, and the short, structured version of this topic is on the Lead Don't Control YouTube channel. Thanks for listening. Lead well and don't control.